So to have an accurate representation of the world, we need to update our beliefs when we receive strong evidence against what we already believe. But we tend to seek, evaluate, and share information supporting what we already believe and ignore information undermining our perspective. So a Myside bias. And this bias interferes with our belief revision, and it has been shown to be linked with polarization as well. So we can think of its consequences both in the individual level and in the societal level. So understanding its boundaries, functions, and developmental trajectory is important in that sense. And if we understand it well, we can also potentially develop some interventions for the context when this bias has detrimental consequences. In our study, we wanted to test two possibilities. On one hand, knowing that you need to convince someone later on might make you select information in a biased manner, selecting information supporting your side and undermining the opposite side, but you might ignore information supporting the opponent's perspective. On the other hand, it is also possible that to convince someone later on, you might select a more strategic information-seeking strategy, and you might select information supporting both your side and the opponent's side, so that you can be better prepared for a later discussion. You can challenge opponent's arguments. So we wanted to test these two possibilities, and what we found was that participants were biased before convincing someone else, and this bias were greater in this argumentative setting compared to the setting when they were simply told that they need to understand whether they were correct. So this increased bias in the argumentative setting might be linked with their motivation to win an argument, thus focusing on information showing that they were right. So what we found is that 5-year-olds tended to seek out information supporting their side, meaning the pros of their side, but they ignored information undermining the other perspective, like the cons of the other side. With increasing age, children also started to select information undermining the opponent's case. So, in other words, by 11 years of age, children's tendency to select information supporting their case and undermining the opponent's case became more balanced. And it looks like there is a shift from 5 to 11 years of age to this more balanced information-seeking strategy. And this might be relevant to a couple of different developmental mechanisms. One might be related to children's exposure to formal and informal argumentation in their social environment and in the school context. We know that, for example, the ability to coordinate the hypothesis and evidence also develops relatively later, and their counter-argumentation skills develop relatively later. Another potential mechanisms that might be playing a role in this shift might be their metacognitive development. So we know that younger children overestimate their own knowledge, and they are generally overconfident. So 5-year-olds over-reliance on information supporting their perspective might be relevant to their overconfidence as well. So I think there are multiple mechanisms that are playing a role in this shift from 5 to 11 years of age. In our study, participants showed Myside bias in an argumentative setting when they need to convince someone later on. And they showed this bias even after making an arbitrary prediction about which they didn't have any previous information or they didn't have any strong feelings. So this shows that this bias is present even after making an arbitrary prediction, and it is influential in human reasoning. On the other hand, we also showed that participants did not show this bias when their aim was to learn if their prediction was correct. So it shows us that although this is an influential bias in human reasoning, we are not always biased. We can be de-biased. So it is important. I also want to add that we need to understand this bias in relation to the consequences it yields across different contexts. This bias may not necessarily be evil in every context. There might be contexts where this bias is functional, and in other contexts where this bias has more detrimental consequences.